The morning of January 15th, 1876, settled over Vicksburg like a heavy shroud. The winds of the Mississippi carried with them the weight of a century's grief, as though sorrow itself had seeped into the air and refused to leave. At Rosewood Plantation, silence ruled. Only the groan of old timbers and the faint murmur of prayers spoken in half-forgotten tongues broke the stillness. It was in this silence that Ezekiel Thompson, 28 years old, opened his eyes for the last time as a man who still believed in the justice of white men. Ezekiel was not like the others. Tall, broad-shouldered, his body carved by years of carrying burdens that had never been his to bear. His roughened hands told stories his lips dared not speak. Born free in the North, he had come to Mississippi in 1874 chasing the promise of honest wages during Reconstruction. What he found was freedom only in name slavery, reborn under contracts and Jim Crow, statutes that twisted rights into privileges for sale. Rosewood Plantation stretched across 2,400 fertile acres along the Mississippi River, some 15 miles from Vicksburg. It was an empire of cotton and cruelty, ruled with absolute authority by Major Conrad Whitfield. 11 years had passed since the Emancipation Proclamation, but Whitfield ran his lands as though freedom were nothing more than a temporary nuisance, a scrap of paper signed by men in Washington who had never bent their backs over the soil tilled by black hands. Before we step deeper into one of the most powerful and hidden chapters of American history, I ask one thing of you: if you believe voices like these deserve to be remembered, subscribe now. And when this story moves you, and it will click the like button and share in the comments where you are watching from. Every gesture helps us carry these forgotten truths further into the light. Vicksburg itself still bore scars of war. The city that had endured Grant's 47-day siege of 1863, where families once hid in caves while cannon fire shattered their streets, had never fully healed. Defeat had fermented into bitterness, whispered in taverns, murmured in pews, and spoken with clenched jaws by men who felt betrayed by fate itself. In the old slave quarters, now rechristened as workers' cabins, there lived 847 men, women, and children, trapped in sharecropping contracts that bound them to servitude under another name. Ezekiel watched them with eyes that remembered what true freedom looked like. He saw Samuel Peterson, the head overseer, hand out rations with calculated cruelty. He noticed how Martha Williams, only 16, dropped her gaze whenever Jake Morrison passed her door. He saw little Thomas, no more than 8, staggering beneath a cotton sack that outweighed his tiny frame. There were 4 overseers at Rosewood: Peterson, Morrison, Davies, and Campbell men who ruled the quarters with iron fists and whips always near at hand. In them, centuries of oppression were distilled into flesh and bone. Each morning they rose with the same purpose: to turn people into property, liberty into privilege, dignity into currency. Samuel Peterson, the eldest, at 52, wore his cruelty like a uniform. A Confederate veteran, he had defended Vicksburg in 1863 and never forgot the humiliation of defeat. The memory haunted him: hunger, fear, the endless thunder of artillery shells, but above all, surrender. To Peterson, every black face was a reminder of that disgrace. Every flicker of resistance became a chance to reclaim the authority he believed the war had stolen. His polished leather boots struck the dirt pathways like gavel blows, each step an unspoken verdict without mercy. If Peterson was the cold precision of hate, then Jake Morrison 34 was its raw violence. His body was not built by honest toil, but by the constant exercise of brutality. His hands, broad as spades, served two purposes, only cracking the whip and seizing what was not his. In the quarters, whispers followed his shadow, his nighttime visits to the cabins of the youngest women, his threats that left only tears and silence behind. Morrison relished his work. Fear was his language, submission his proof of power. Where Peterson's cruelty was systematic, Morrison's was immediate searing and without disguise. And then there was Robert Davies, whose malice carried a different weight, intellectual, deliberate, sharpened like a blade of fine steel. Robert Davies had once been an accountant, a man of numbers who discovered in the management of contracts a darker power than any whip. Where others scarred flesh, he scarred hope. His genius lay in turning ink into chains, creating impossible debts, manipulating ledgers, transforming promised wages into obligations without end. Families who signed his papers unknowingly signed away not only their futures, but the futures of their children's children. His round spectacles glinted with cold precision as he reviewed his books, ledgers that were not accounts, but death warrants for dreams. For Davies, shackles of iron were crude. Shackles of debt were eternal. His pen was a blade sharper than steel, and he wielded it with surgical cruelty. If Davies enslaved through ink, Marcus Campbell enslaved through fury. At 29, the youngest of the overseers, he was also the most volatile. The war had ruined his family's small farm, and the bitterness of that loss festered into a venom he directed at those he believed responsible. In him, racial hatred blended with class resentment, a poison that colored every glance, every word, every order. Campbell grew up on stories of the good old days when everyone knew their place. The new world confused him, enraged him. The idea that black men and women could claim the same rights as whites was to him an abomination. His life became a constant tantrum against a universe that refused to restore what he thought he was owed. Ezekiel watched them all. He measured their rhythms, their weaknesses. His northern education had given him not only literacy, but a way of seeing patterns others missed. He read the contracts Davies forged, saw through the laws that denied them justice, and recognized the cycle of oppression perpetuated by the overseers. His knowledge was supposed to be a gift of freedom. Instead, it became a curse because it made him see too clearly. He could not look away from the truth that others endured in silence. It was in late December when Ezekiel's fragile hope was shattered. Martha Williams, the 16-year-old whose wide eyes reminded him of the sister he'd lost in the cholera epidemic of 1871, failed to appear for her morning shift. The women whispered, the men avoided each other's gaze, and even the children seemed to have forgotten how to laugh. 3 days later, Martha's body surfaced in the muddy creek that ran through Rosewood. The marks upon her told a story too brutal to mistake, but the overseers called it an accident. Major Whitfield dismissed it as a closed matter. No investigation, no justice. Not even a pause for mourning. Her mother's grief, raw and unacknowledged, became the grief of the entire quarter. Ezekiel felt the weight of her tears as acid on the thin fabric of endurance. That night, lying on a straw mattress beside 2 other men, he stared at the ceiling, where moonlight streamed through cracks falling in bars of light that looked too much like prison grates. The ore stank of sweat, despair, and silence. But now, something else seeped into it, metallic and sharp. It took Ezekiel hours to name it. The scent of revenge. The weeks that followed brought a punishing winter to Mississippi. Bitter cold sank into the cabins, where illness spread as quickly as whispers of revolt. The overseers, their tempers shortened by discomfort, unleashed their violence with even greater relish. And yet, within this suffering, Ezekiel's eyes remained vigilant. He began to notice patterns. Peterson, ever disciplined, made his final rounds at precisely 2:30 a.m. Morrison, a creature of indulgence, drank himself senseless every Thursday night. Davis lingered in his office well past midnight, inventing new deaths, burying men alive in numbers. Campbell, lightest sleeper of them all, had one flaw. Every new moon he left the plantation for his clandestine visits to the widow Henderson in town, returning just before dawn. Ezekiel never sat down to plan what would happen next. Justice, when it emerges from centuries of suffocated pain, is not written on paper first. It is born of timing, of courage, of opportunity. A volatile chemistry waiting for the strike of a spark. The new moon of January 14th, 1876 brought darkness so absolute that even the stars seemed swallowed whole. In the quarters, the silence changed. It was no longer resignation. It was the silence before a storm. Ezekiel awoke at 2:15 a.m. Not by choice, not by design. Something within his chest, perhaps Martha Williams' own spirit, shook him from sleep. He dressed quietly, pulled on his worn boots, and stepped into the frozen night. The cold cut through the air like a blade, yet Ezekiel hardly noticed it. His boots crunched softly over frozen ground. Sound muted, ghostly. In the distance, the faint glow of Davy's office window flickered a sentinel over his ledgers of suffering, the calculations of future misery. Peterson's cabin lay ahead in perfect stillness. The head overseer slept deeply wrapped in the numb comfort of a conscience long hardened by cruelty. There was no plan, no conspiracy. Only a man moving through the darkness of a winter dawn, carrying the weight of every injustice he had witnessed, every tear he could not dry, every muffled scream he could not answer. When he reached the tool shed, his hands already knew their task. The axe used for chopping firewood weighed 3 pounds of forged steel with a sturdy oak handle. In Ezekiel's hands, it became more than a tool. It became an instrument of justice, a verdict that white courts would never hand down. The hours to come would change the lives of every soul on Rosewood Plantation, echoing through time as a cry of freedom that no Jim Crow law could silence. The weight of the axe felt familiar, almost comforting. It carried memories of his childhood in Pennsylvania, where his father Isaiah Thompson had taught him to split wood outside their small cabin near Philadelphia. Isaiah, born a slave in Virginia, had escaped via the Underground Railroad in 1842, 4 years before Ezekiel's birth. The old man's hands, scarred from chains and whips, had trembled the first time he held his newborn son, a boy born free, something Isaiah had never dared to imagine. Boy Isaiah would say as they worked side by side in their garden, "Freedom ain't something they give you. It's something you take and hold with both hands." Those words echoed in Ezekiel's mind as he stood in the Mississippi, chill lungs burning with cold. His father had died in 1873, never knowing the path his son would take, never imagining that Ezekiel would one day find himself in a place where even Virginia's plantations seemed merciful by comparison. Ezekiel's education began in the basement of Mother Bethlehem Church, where escaped slaves and freedmen gathered to teach literacy in secret. By 12, he was teaching younger children their letters. By 16, he had devoured every book he could find: the Bible, Frederick Douglass's autobiography, copies of The Liberator, shipped months late from Boston, but still burning with righteous fury. His mother Sarah worked as a seamstress for wealthy Philadelphia families, stitching beautiful garments for white women, while her own clothes remained patched and plain. Every penny she saved was a bet on her son's future. "Education is the ladder out of this hole," she said, candlelight flickering across her mending. "Don't you ever stop climbing." When Sarah succumbed to tuberculosis in the winter of 1872, Ezekiel felt the ground shift beneath him. Her small inheritance, $37 and a well-worn sewing kit, was both a blessing and a burden. Without family ties to hold him north, the promises of work and opportunity in the South, however perilous, began to seem not only possible, but necessary. The journey south was Ezekiel's first encounter with the fickle face of freedom. In Pennsylvania, he was Ezekiel Thompson, educated, respected. Cross into Maryland, and he became just another black man, suspect by default. By the late summer of 1874, arriving in Mississippi, he saw that Reconstruction was failing before it had truly begun. Promises of 40 acres and a mule are dissolved into exploitative sharecropping contracts written in language designed to confuse, trap, and deny the rights supposedly guaranteed by the 14th and 15th Amendments. Freedom existed on paper in Washington, but not in Mississippi. Rosewood Plantation had seemed a beacon when Major Whitfield's advertisement appeared in the Vicksburg Herald seeking an educated black man to manage plantation records and worker contracts. Fair wages for honest work. But Ezekiel soon realized the truth. The system was more sophisticated than slavery, but no less cruel. The major needed someone literate. Someone who could read and write well enough to maintain the illusion of legality around contracts deliberately designed never to be honored. Within weeks, Ezekiel realized the bitter truth: he had become complicit in the very system he had come south to escape. His task was simple in appearance, but devastating in effect. He read contracts aloud to workers who could not read for themselves, explaining terms that seemed fair but were laced with hidden clauses and impossible conditions. Families signed away their freedom with little more than an X beside their names, trusting Ezekiel to tell them the truth when the truth itself had become a luxury he could no longer afford. Samuel Peterson despised him immediately. To the head overseer, a literate black man was an affront to the natural order, a violation of every belief he held about racial hierarchy. Peterson had grown up on a plantation in Alabama, where black and white were divided absolutely and without question. The Civil War had destroyed that world, but Peterson was determined to reconstruct it one whip crack at a time. His years of military service had extinguished any remaining capacity for mercy. At the Battle of Champion Hill, barely 20 miles from where he now stood, he had watched Union soldiers, many of them black, overrun Confederate positions with what he called savage efficiency. The memory of armed black men in blue burned into him like a brand. Every day since he had worked to remind the black population of what he considered their proper place in the world. Peterson's cruelty was systematic, calculated, and purposeful. He understood that breaking a body could be temporary, but breaking a spirit left scars that would pass down through generations. His genius lay in making oppression feel natural, inevitable, even deserved. Jake Morrison, by contrast, was brutality made flesh. Where Peterson was a surgeon of suffering, Morrison was a butcher. He grew up poor, the son of a drunken father who had lost their cotton farm, and a mother who died giving birth to her 8th child. From an early age, he learned that only strength mattered, and he had been accumulating it indiscriminately ever since. His assaults on the plantation's female workers were an open secret. Major Whitfield knew, Peterson knew, the workers knew. But knowledge without power was meaningless. Morrison took what he wanted when he wanted, secure in the knowledge that no court would ever believe a black woman over a white man. Martha Williams, the girl with dark, flawless skin and eyes that seemed to pierce the soul, had become his latest target. Her spirit, though battered, refused to be completely broken, and Morrison's obsession had been building for months. He believed resistance was merely a delay before inevitability. Her mother, Ruth Williams, tried to protect her daughter as best she could, keeping Martha close, ensuring she never worked alone, surrounding her with other women who could witness any predatory acts. But protection was fragile when the predator carried both the authority of the plantation and the protection of law. Robert Davies represented yet another subtler form of evil oppression, masked in respectability. His office, tucked in the main house, overflowed with ledgers that measured human lives in profit and debt. To Davies, he was a mere businessman, applying sound financial principles to plantation management. That these principles brought pain and suffering to countless people was regrettable but necessary in his view. He had studied accounting at the University of Mississippi before the war interrupted his education, returning to a world where the old certainties were gone, replaced by chaos. Davies thrived in that chaos, turning numbers into chains, contracts into prisons, and spreadsheets into instruments of human misery. The mathematical precision of accounting was Davies' refuge from uncertainty. Numbers never lied. Numbers never argued. Numbers never questioned the moral weight of their arrangement. His genius lay in crafting debts that multiplied on their own. A family might borrow money for spring seed toil under the relentless summer sun, and at harvest discover that they owed more than they had begun, with interest, storage fees, equipment, rental housing costs, food advances. With the stroke of a pen, Davies could make money vanish or appear, keeping the plantation workers desperate enough to toil, yet never free enough to leave. Marcus Campbell's hatred was more personal, rooted in a loss that no words could fully capture. His family had once been small farmers, proud but modest, owning 160 acres in northern Mississippi. They looked down on both wealthy planters and enslaved people alike, too proud to serve, too poor to rule. The war destroyed everything his family had built over generations. Union troops burned their homes, slaughtered their livestock, leaving only ashes and grief. His father died of a heart attack in 1867, sitting on the porch of a sharecropper's cabin forced upon them. His mother followed a year later, worn down by poverty and heartbreak. Campbell blamed black people for his loss. In his twisted logic, if they had stayed content with slavery, there would have been no war, no devastation, no personal ruin. Every black face became a reminder of what had been stolen from him. Every sign of advancement a personal insult demanding correction. As an overseer, he had the power he craved, and the authority to inflict the suffering he felt had been unfairly inflicted upon him. Every punishment he administered was a small repayment of a debt that could never be satisfied revenge for a life he should have lived but never would. Together, the four overseers formed a perfect storm of oppression. Peterson, with his systematic brutality. Morrison with his raw physical violence. Davies with his economic entrapment, and Campbell with his personal venom. They created a world where hope itself became an act of rebellion. Ezekiel had witnessed this system for 18 months, memorizing its mechanisms while playing his assigned part. Strong men reduced to shadows, children aged before their time, dreams murdered by custom rather than law. The pressure had been building like steam for weeks before Martha's death, small cruelties and large injustices stacking into an inevitable explosion. A child whipped for spilling milk, a woman punished for a glance, an old man forced to labor with a fever until he collapsed and died in the fields. But Martha's death was different. Not a product of calculated cruelty, nor a systematic oppression. It was pure evil revealed in darkness, leaving victims floating in mud with stories untold and justice denied. Ezekiel had found her himself in the early hours along the creek when sleep refused him. Her young face, unnaturally peaceful in death, bore the marks of violence that turned his stomach and set his hands shaking with rage. He ran to the quarters calling for help, knowing instinctively that the help he needed would not come. Ruth Williams' screams tore through the morning like a blade grief, so raw and terrible it seemed to split the sky itself. The official investigation lasted exactly 4 hours. Sheriff Thomas Bradshaw, a man beholden to Major Whitfield's influence, examined the body, spoke briefly with Morrison and Campbell, and declared Martha's death an accidental drowning. Case closed. Life moved on, but not for everyone. Ruth Williams aged 10 years in the days following her daughter's funeral. Her grief, a permanent mark upon the plantation that no law or ledger could erase. The other women in the quarters moved like ghosts, gliding through their chores with eyes that jumped at every shadow, voices hushed to whispers. The men labored with heads bowed and fists clenched, craving justice. They knew they could never afford, yet clinging to the desire nonetheless. In those days after Martha's death, something inside Ezekiel died as well. Not hope exactly, but the illusion that hope could exist within a system so monstrously corrupt. All his education, all his meticulous records of injustice, all his belief in the eventual triumph of right over wrong, meant nothing in a world where a 16-year-old girl could be murdered and her killer returned to work the next day as if nothing had happened. Standing in the tool shed, axe in hand, Ezekiel felt the weight of every story he had witnessed, every cry he had been powerless to answer, every injustice he had been forced to record but never challenge. The axe was no longer a simple tool. It had become the concentrated will of every person denied justice, every dream snuffed out, every hope strangled in its cradle. The night was dark, but Ezekiel's purpose was crystal clear. Justice was coming to Rosewood Plantation, delivered by the hands of a man who had finally stopped believing that others would provide what he alone could. The darkness around him seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if the plantation itself held its breath. With each step away from the shed, the axe felt heavier, not in pounds, but in moral, spiritual weight. Every footfall across the frozen ground marked his transformation, from the man he had been to the man he was about to become. There would be no turning back tonight. He understood this with the rare clarity that comes when everything that matters hangs in the balance. The plantation stretched before him like a map of oppression made flesh. To his left, the quarters held 847 souls trapped between freedom and slavery. To his right, the main house rose white columns gleaming in starlight, like the bones of some ancient beast. Between them stood the overseer's cabins, 4 small structures housing 4 men whose deaths would alter everything. Ezekiel's first stop was Samuel Peterson's cabin. The head overseer lived alone. His wife had died 3 years prior, supposedly of a broken heart over the South's defeat. Though everyone knew the truth, shame had consumed her, unable to endure the man her husband had become after Appomattox. The cabin stood dark smoke curling from the chimney into the frozen night. Peterson would be sleeping deeply confident in his authority, certain of his invulnerability. In his mind, black people were children capable of mischief but incapable of true rebellion. Ezekiel approached the front door with the quiet precision of a man who had learned to move carefully in a dangerous world. The door was unlocked. Who would dare threaten a white overseer in Mississippi? The hinges creaked softly as he pushed it open, barely louder than Peterson's steady snoring. Inside the cabin reflected its master. Everything was neat, orderly, arranged with military precision. Peterson's Confederate uniform hung in a place of honor by the door, cleaned and pressed. On the table, his ledger lay open, recording punishments with brutal efficiency. His bedroom door was ajar, revealing Peterson sprawled in sleep, one arm across his face, the other dangling toward the floor. Even in slumber, his face held an expression of cruel satisfaction, as if he dreamed of the suffering he orchestrated. Ezekiel raised the axe above his head. For a heartbeat, hesitation flickered. This was murder cold and calculated. Once the blade fell, he would become everything the law feared: a dangerous black man, a savage returned to his true nature. But then Martha Williams' face appeared in his mind, floating in the creek, and hesitation died. The axe came down with deadly precision. Peterson's eyes flew open, confusion and terror flashing across his features before the steel bit deep. His body jerked once, convulsed, then lay still. Dark, thick blood spread across the pillow, gleaming in the sliver of moonlight filtering through the window. Ezekiel lingered over the body, expecting an emotion: remorse, satisfaction, fear, but felt only a strange emptiness, as if he had completed a task that demanded completion. 1 down, 3 to go. Jake Morrison's cabin lay a quarter-mile away, closer to the quarters where he kept watch over the women he considered property. The British overseer Jake Morrison lived in squalor that mirrored his inner corruption. Empty whiskey bottles littered the yard, and the air hung heavy with the stench of unwashed clothes and rotting food. Unlike Peterson, Morrison was awake when Ezekiel arrived. He sat at his kitchen table drinking straight from a bottle of corn whiskey while meticulously cleaning his Colt Navy revolver, a weapon he wore like a badge of office. Morrison squinted through alcohol-glazed eyes at the dark silhouette framed in the doorway. Who the hell, he began, but froze as recognition spread across his face. A slow, cruel smile stretched his lips. Well, look what we got here. The educated boy come to pay a visit. You looking for trouble, boy? No, Ezekiel said quietly, stepping into the dim light. "I am looking for justice." Morrison laughed harshly, a grating, mocking sound. "Justice from you? You forget your place, boy. You forget what happens to." The axe slammed into his chest before he could finish the sentence. Shock and pain flickered across Morrison's eyes as the blade pierced between his ribs, finding his heart with surgical precision. He tried to lift his pistol, but strength had already left his body. The gun clattered to the floor as Morrison pitched forward, landing face first on the table. Ezekiel withdrew the axe, blood splattering the wall behind him. Morrison twitched once, twice, and then lay still. The metallic scent of death mingled with whiskey and filth, a fitting tribute to a man who had spread rot wherever he went. 2 down, 2 to go. Robert Davies proved more challenging. The accountant labored late in the basement office of the main house, surrounded by ledgers and contracts that had chained hundreds in economic slavery. Methodical in every part of his life, Davies kept a shotgun beside his desk and a small derringer in his vest pocket. Ezekiel approached the main house with extreme caution. Major Whitfield was away in Jackson, but staff might be awake. Using the servants' entrance, he moved through the kitchen and pantry with the quiet precision honed over 18 months of plantation work. The basement office glowed under oil lamps, Davies' round spectacles reflecting the light, like the eyes of some pale nocturnal predator. "Ezekiel," he said calmly, as if midnight visits from armed black men were routine. "Working late tonight, something like that?" Ezekiel replied, stepping into the circle of light cast by the lamps. Davies' hand drifted toward the shotgun. "I suppose you've heard about the unfortunate accident with the Williams girl. Tragic really, but accidents happen. The important thing is to learn from them and move on. She didn't die by accident," Ezekiel said, raising the blood-stained axe. "And I suppose you have evidence to support that claim." Davies' fingers brushed the shotgun stock. "Without evidence, it's just one person's word against another's. And we both know whose carries more weight in Mississippi. I've got all the evidence I need. Right here," Ezekiel said, the axe poised. Davies lunged for the shotgun, but age and soft living had dulled him. Ezekiel was faster driven by righteous fury. The axe bit into Davies' neck, a spray of blood painting the account books, the instruments of his cruelty, with the color of justice. Davies clutched at the wound, trying to speak, but only blood emerged. He collapsed backward in his chair, papers fluttering like snow around him, each page a testament to lives destroyed and futures stolen. 3 down, 1 to go. Marcus Campbell was the hardest to find. True to his pattern, he had slipped away to visit the widow Henderson in Vicksburg. Ezekiel waited in Campbell's cabin, seated in darkness clock, ticking toward dawn. Campbell returned just before 4:00 a.m., humming under his breath and reeking of cheap whiskey and perfume. He fumbled with the door latch, muttering when it stuck. Inside, he never saw Ezekiel lurking in the shadows beside the fireplace. "Rough night, Campbell?" Ezekiel asked quietly. Campbell spun, hand instinctively, going to the knife at his belt. Rage and disgust twisted his face. "You got some nerve, boy, breaking into a white man's house. You looking to get yourself lynched," maybe Ezekiel said, standing slowly. "But not before I finish what I started." Campbell's eyes widened as he saw the axe and the blood-stained blade. "Jesus Christ, what have you done?" "What needed doing?" Ezekiel replied. Campbell drew his long war knife, young, fast, and desperate. He lunged at Ezekiel, a man who had killed before, and expected to kill again. The fight was brief, vicious. Campbell was strong, relentless. But Ezekiel had the longer reach and the heavier weapon. The knife sliced across Ezekiel's left shoulder, drawing a grunt of pain. But the axe answered with devastating force. The blade slammed into Campbell's ribs, cracking bone and tearing through muscle. Campbell staggered, coughing blood, but refused to yield. He grabbed Ezekiel's throat with one hand, attempting to crush his windpipe while swinging the knife for a killing strike. Ezekiel twisted narrowly, avoiding the blade, and brought the axe handle up under Campbell's chin. The overseer's head snapped back, and Ezekiel followed through with the blade, driving it across his chest. Blood sprayed across the cabin walls, crimson against the dim lamplight. Campbell crashed into the kitchen table, sending plates and cups flying. He tried to rise, tried to lift his knife one final time, but his strength had abandoned him. "You're going to hang for this." Campbell gasped, eyes blazing with hatred and disbelief. "They'll hunt you down like the animal you are." "Maybe," Ezekiel said, standing over him. "But you won't be there to see it." Campbell went, still curse on his lips, blood on his hands. The last of the 4 men who had made life hell for everyone in their power. The cabin fell silent except for Ezekiel's heavy breathing and the faint tick of the mantel clock. Justice had been served. Ezekiel stepped out into the first grey light of dawn. His clothes were soaked with blood, some his own, most the men's. The axe hung heavy in his hand, its blade dulled by bone and cartilage, but its purpose fulfilled. Behind him lay 4 dead men who would never again raise a whip-steal wages or destroy innocent lives. The system they had upheld would continue, but without them. By full daylight, the bodies would be discovered. The sheriff would be summoned, dogs unleashed, and a hunt begun. A black man who killed 4 white men in Mississippi in 1876 could expect no mercy from human law. Yet as Ezekiel walked back toward the quarters where workers were beginning to stir with the sunrise, he felt something he hadn't in years: peace. Martha Williams had been avenged. Her murderers had been called to account. The sun rose blood red over Rosewood Plantation, painting the sky the color of justice. At 6:30 a.m., Samuel Peterson failed to appear for morning roll call. For 18 years, he had been as punctual as sunrise itself. His absence sent a ripple of confusion across the plantation. Mary Johnson, the cook, found his body first. Her scream pierced the morning air, sending birds scattering and workers running from all directions. The scene in Peterson's cabin would be burned into their memories forever. The brutal efficiency, the blood, the expression of frozen surprise on the dead man's face. Word spread like wildfire. Morrison was found slumped over his table. Davies lay in his office, ledgers soaked crimson. Campbell's cabin bore the marks of struggle. Overturned furniture, blood-stained walls, and the body of the final overseer. Major Conrad Whitfield received the telegram in Jackson. His response was swift and predictable. Every law enforcement officer in western Mississippi was summoned. Sheriff Thomas Bradshaw arrived with 20 grim men, fully aware that 4 white men had been murdered by a likely black assailant. The investigation that followed was relentless. Bradshaw and his men scoured the plantation-examined cabins. questioned workers, and searched every hiding place. Bloodhounds arrived by noon, baying as they traced every scent across the cotton fields. But Ezekiel did not hide. When they reached his cabin, he was sitting calmly on the doorstep, still in his blood-stained clothes. The axe lay beside him, blade still marked by its night's work. He showed no fear, no attempt to flee, no regret. "You Ezekiel Thompson?" Sheriff Bradshaw asked, hand resting on his pistol. "I am," Ezekiel replied. "You killed those 4 men." "I did." The simplicity of his confession stunned everyone. In their experience, guilt came with denial, plea bargaining, or flight. Not this calm, unflinching truth. They didn't sit quietly confessing to quadruple murder as if discussing the weather. "Why, Sheriff Bradshaw?" asked his voice, rough but curious. Ezekiel looked up, steady and calm. "Because they needed killing." The arrest was swift. Iron shackles bit into his wrists and ankles as he was loaded into a wagon bound for the Vicksburg jail. Hundreds of Rosewood workers watched in silence as the wagon rolled away. Some wept not for the dead overseers, but for the man who had done what they all wished they could, yet never dared. The trial was scheduled for February 15th, exactly 1 month after the killings. Judge Cornelius Whitman presided, a man known for harsh sentences against black defendants and leniency toward white criminals. The courtroom overflowed with white spectators, while black attendees were forced to stand at the back or shiver outside in the February cold. Ezekiel's court-appointed attorney, Thomas Mitchell, was young and inexperienced with capital cases. Competent, yet overwhelmed. Across the room, District Attorney William Harper, a man with political ambitions, saw the case as his ticket to fame. The prosecution's case was devastatingly simple. 4 respected white men brutally murdered by a black man who had confessed. Physical evidence was overwhelming: blood on Ezekiel's clothes, fingerprints on the murder weapon, eyewitness testimony, placing him at each scene. Harper painted him as a savage, a predator who used his education to orchestrate terror. Mitchell's defense was constrained by 1876 Mississippi law. He could not claim self-defense. None of the victims had attacked Ezekiel. He could not argue insanity. Ezekiel's calm, rational confession disproved it. He could not dispute the evidence; it was irrefutable. Instead, Mitchell sought context, calling witnesses to describe life at Rosewood Plantation, the abuse endured by its workers, Martha Williams's death, and the lack of a true investigation. He painted a portrait of systemic oppression, hoping the jury might understand why a man could be driven to such desperate acts. The strategy failed. The all-white jury deliberated for exactly 17 minutes, guilty on all 4 counts of murder in the first degree. Judge Whitman sentenced Ezekiel to death by hanging scheduled for March 15, 1876. Yet, in the month before his execution, Ezekiel's story began to spread beyond Mississippi. Telegraphs and newspapers carried it to other states where memories of the Civil War and Reconstruction still lingered. In Philadelphia, his childhood church held prayer vigils and letter-writing campaigns. In Boston, abolitionists who had fought for decades viewed him as a symbol of enduring injustice. Even in Washington, a few Republican congressmen questioned law enforcement and the administration of justice in the post-war South. The pressure could not save Ezekiel's life, but it transformed his execution into a national spectacle. Reporters arrived from New York, Chicago, and beyond, turning what should have been a routine hanging into an event that would be remembered. Back at Rosewood Plantation, Major Whitfield struggled without his overseers. Replacement supervisors were either too weak or too cruel. Production faltered as workers engaged in slowdowns, accidents, and sabotage. Families fled under cover of darkness, abandoning their contracts and heading north, defying legal threats. Across the region, other landowners noticed growing unrest among their laborers. Ezekiel Thompson, the educated black man who had killed 4 overseers without remorse, became a legend. His story spread like gospel through the quarters, and the cotton fields whispered in awe and reverence. On the morning of March 15, 1876, Ezekiel walked to the gallows in Vicksburg Courthouse Square with the same calm dignity he had shown at trial. Hundreds crowded the square, white spectators, eager for justice. Black observers witnessing the death of a man who had become a symbol of resistance. The prison chaplain offered last rites, which Ezekiel politely declined. Sheriff Bradshaw asked if he had final words. Ezekiel scanned the crowd, finding the faces of those who had come to see him stand for justice. Martha Williams was 16 years old, he said, voice carrying across the silent square. She deserved justice. They all deserve justice. If my death is the price of their peace, I pay it willingly. At 12:07 p.m., the trapdoor opened. Ezekiel Thompson died instantly. His neck snapped cleanly. He was buried in the black section of Vicksburg Cemetery, marked only with his name and dates. No flowers, no monument, but people came anyway. In the weeks and months that followed, his grave became an unofficial shrine. Wildflowers, coins, scraps of paper, with prayers all left in quiet homage. Authorities removed them repeatedly, but the tokens always returned. The impact of Ezekiel's actions extended far beyond his death. Major Whitfield eventually sold Rosewood Plantation, unable to maintain productivity without his brutal overseers. The property was divided into smaller farms, many purchased by black families who had scraped together enough money to escape the sharecropping trap. More importantly, Ezekiel's case exposed post-Reconstruction Mississippi to the nation. Northern newspapers, which had ignored countless abuses, suddenly paid attention. Law enforcement agencies across the South found themselves under unprecedented scrutiny. And while the South would continue to resist justice, the story of one man's courage, one man's defiance, and one girl's lost life could not be silenced. The cursory investigation into Martha Williams's death, followed by the relentless manhunt for her avenger, created a stark contrast that no one could ignore. While change in the South came slowly and unevenly, the glare of national attention made casual brutality harder to hide, harder to excuse. More importantly, Ezekiel's story became part of the oral tradition sustaining black communities through the darkest years of Jim Crow. Parents whispered it to their children, the tale of the educated man who had faced the overseers, who had chosen justice over safety, who had met death with calm and dignity. The story grew with each telling, becoming a legend that carried hope across generations. In 1954, when the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education, an elderly black woman in Jackson, Mississippi, was heard to say Ezekiel Thompson would be proud to see this day. Most had no idea whom she referenced, yet the name had been passed down in families who remembered the courage that had once defied oppression. Civil rights workers in the 1960s discovered the story still alive in the communities they served. Young activists facing police dogs and fire hoses drew strength from a man who had confronted his executioners with dignity and purpose intact. Today, Ezekiel Thompson's name appears in no history textbooks. His grave bears no official marker. The 4 overseers he killed are equally forgotten, their names lost to time along with the details of their crimes. But the echo of that bloody night in January 1876 persists in the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. In the end, Ezekiel Thompson's legacy was not the violence he committed, but the dignity with which he accepted its consequences. He understood that some injustices are so profound they demand answers no court would grant, no law would permit, and he was willing to pay the ultimate price to provide that answer. His story reminds us that progress often comes at terrible cost, paid by individuals whose names may be forgotten, yet whose actions ripple through history. Martha Williams rests in an unmarked grave beside the creek where her body was found. Ezekiel Thompson lies in Vicksburg Cemetery under a simple stone. The 4 overseers rest in the white section, their elaborate monuments crumbling slowly with time and weather. But the story continues. Every time someone stands up to injustice, despite the personal cost, every time courage overcomes fear against overwhelming odds, the spirit of that night in 1876 lives again. Justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it arrives in ways no court sanctions and no law permits. Sometimes it comes in the hands of a person who has suffered enough to finally say no more. Ezekiel Thompson's story ended on a gallows in Vicksburg, but his legacy lives on every time courage prevails over comfort, every time justice is chosen over safety. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you why we cannot forget our history, share it. Pass it on to someone who needs to hear it. Hit that like button and help this story reach more people.